Cheers everyone, Casey Turbin here of Addressing Winchester with a third installment of our Winchester Black History Profiles. And instead of a person, this one will be a bit more conceptual and about the Emancipation Proclamation in Winchester. This will also be part of a longer video addressing slavery in the Valley as a whole coming out later this week. Now, by January 1st, 1863, the American Civil War was fully mobilized. The number of battles had climbed into the dozens, and the number of dead surpassed the hundreds of thousands, numbers that were simply unimaginable when the war broke out just a year and a half before. The previous September, the Lincoln administration had raised the stakes of the war by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, for the first time showing the intent to make the abolition of slavery a war aim of the Union Army. The proclamation had been issued in the wake of a Union victory at Antietam that had sent Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia slipping away back into Central Virginia and out of the grasp of the advantageous circumstances presented for the Federals at Antietam Creek. Now, the victory signaled to Lincoln the time was right to move to free the enslaved in the Confederate States, but by no means was the Union war effort on the footing to exercise its military will over the Confederacy. January 1st, 1863 saw Lincoln sign his famous proclamation into law, but its implementation, effectiveness, and even its permanence were all uncertain. But that brings us to the bustling market town of Winchester, sitting atop of the Confederacy's Shenandoah Valley. There was great confusion on all sides as how to emancipation would work. The people that emboldened and enshrined the legacy of Stonewall Jackson were now faced with massive changes. From enslavers to Union soldiers, no one was sure exactly how to transmit, or in the case of the enslavers, keep the info away from those that were now free from bondage. Taking control of the situation was a fiery abolitionist general from Indiana named Robert H Milroy, in charge of a 7,500-man Union army. Now, for a moment of acknowledgement, none of this video would be possible without the writings and research of Professor Jonathan Noyalas, the director of the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah University. Jonathan wrote the biography on Milroy entitled My Will is Absolute Law, as well as more recently a pivotal and much-needed work titled Slavery and Freedom in the Shenandoah Valley During the Civil War Era. Please check the YouTube description for links to purchase these titles and support his scholarship. Robert H Milroy may be one of the most controversial generals of the entire Civil War. He was born near Salem, Indiana in the summer of 1816 and grew up to graduate from the Norwich Academy, the oldest private military academy in the country. Like so many of his peers, Milroy was destined to serve, but didn't see combat in the Mexican-American War. Then he settled into a life of law before the Civil War broke out. His fiery Republican abolitionist tendencies were not shared by many in overall Union command as emancipation became a new war motive. But for Milroy, Lincoln's new war policy was exactly what he needed to exercise his will over Winchester's heavily Confederate population. As emancipation became law, Milroy was in command of a 7,500-man division of Union soldiers spread across Winchester and the lower Shenandoah Valley. Now, this is important to note in the Valley's greater slave history. There has long been a misconception that there was not a great deal of slavery in the Shenandoah Valley, and that is simply incorrect in the continuation of false claims made in the wake of the war. Critical assessment of census data and property records reveals the truth, and at the outbreak of the Civil War, over 20% of the Valley's population was enslaved, which was in step with trends overall in antebellum Virginia. The great plantations of central and tidewater Virginia certainly harvested larger plots of land and enslaved larger groups of people per family, but in the Shenandoah Valley there was plenty of grueling work to be delegated to smaller family operations with a half dozen or less enslaved laborers, as well as the domestic task of cooking and child rearing reserved for maybe one or two enslaved persons in the more densely populated towns like Winchester. Regardless of the lost cause assessments about the character of the Scots-Irish and the Germans that largely settled the valley, the truth is the institution was pervasive, just as violent as in the Deep South, and benefited nobody but the enslaver. These are all topics explored at depth in Jonathan Noyalas' book shared before, and I will be posting a longer video this week about the failed slavery thesis in the Valley. Now, by January 5th, 1863, Robert Milroy was not going to be a passive participant in the matriculation of the Emancipation news. In fact, he issued his own emancipation document, directed to the enslavers of the Valley, entitled Freedom to Slaves, that he sent out with daily patrols of Union men to read and share door to door and farm to farm across Virginia's gently warming fertile valley in the early spring of 1863. Now, according to Milroy's biographer, Noyalas, there were 4 key elements to the emancipatory document. Firstly, that the areas around Winchester were within the confines that the overall Emancipation Proclamation affected. Secondly, Milroy informed the area's enslavers and Confederate sympathizers that there were to be no obstacles made to the implementation of the new directive. It's important to note that even area unionists were not all on board with emancipation by any stretch of the imagination. And even within the men of the Union Army, opinions on the orders varied between support and full-throated opposition. In response, Milroy's third directive was to his men, informing them that they were to get behind the implementation of the emancipation. And finally, Milroy made it clear in his fourth element that the enslaved of the Valley were now free, and the Union Army was going to be a machine to free them, and that there was to be no violence or disturbance to the persons or properties that once bound them. Even with a vocal ally like Milroy, freedom was a tricky and fleeting thing once emancipation became law. Some opted to run to the Union Army, a decision some enslaved people made even before the proclamation was an idea, as Union armies passed by in 1861 and 62. Others waited until opportunity was right to flee, because by no means did getting to Maryland or central Pennsylvania mean freedom, while Confederate armies were still capable and would again plunge into northern states on campaigns fighting battles, but also sending both free and former enslaved people back south to be re-enslaved into the Confederate war effort. In fact, Milroy's command would be swept out of Lee's way during his famed Gettysburg campaign, and the Gray Eagle's abolitionist success would always be wrapped up in his greatest failure, with the loss at the Second Battle of Winchester. The greater emancipation story begins in the lower valley with Milroy's Freedom to Slaves order, but for many of those in actual bondage, unable to flee even under the guidance of the Union Army, it would take years for freedom to become a reality. Now, these topics and the story of Reconstruction will be told in the next video coming out this week. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe and follow to support Addressing Winchester.